Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. It is December 1st in the year 2020. We're still in the midst of the coronavirus COVID pandemic and lockdown. And today we're going to talk about something that kind of just hit the internet in the Mormon/ex-Mormon world a few days ago. And that is over the Thanksgiving holiday, FAIRMormon, the kind of secretly, some sort of under the table church funded apologetic arm of the church, released a whole slew of videos meant to really answer the challenge that the letter to the CES director poses to the church and its claims. One of the fresh young faces of millennial Mormon apologetics, a gentleman by the name of Kwaku, is kind of the main face and the main driving force behind the videos. They have a much more loose and free style, not afraid to kind of throw a few punches back at the critics of the church and inject some of the millennial humor that those of us in the older generations find so endearing and relevant. That was sarcasm. At any rate, one of the videos in particular was a video about Joseph Smith's polygamy, and it answers or attempts to answer some of the criticisms in that video. And as you go through that, there's a whole bunch of things that people could say in response to it. And as I frequently do, I come across people's various answers. One response to that video really stood out to me, and that was a Facebook post by former Mormon Bishop Sam Pinson, who really just took the first 3 minutes of the video and just showed how so much of it kind of glossed over, ignored, or completely misrepresented actual legitimate concerns that people have regarding Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy. And a couple of the points really hit hard on something that is very important to me, which is the concept of when you let go of Mormonism, when your values no longer align with the values espoused by the church, frequently when you step away from the church, you're accused of being some sort of immoral or amoral miscreant who just has, you may as well be out raping babies and doing all sorts of terrible things, because without the morality that Mormonism espouses through God and through the objective morality of God, then we're left to basically some sort of Hobbesian notion of a dog-eat-dog world. And I don't think that that's true. I think that's a misrepresentation. And they tie that to the notion of atheism being the wellspring from which that comes. And I thought Sam Pinson did such a great job of just kind of looking at their arguments on this point. And so for today's video, I'd like to really just focus on those particular arguments on the point. And I was able to get Sam to actually join us. So Sam Pinson, former LDS Bishop Sam Pinson, is here as my guest. How are you doing today, Sam?
I'm well, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So, I was so impressed. Your family famously went through a Mormon Stories podcast interview last year, I believe, or somewhere around that time. And those of us that follow that podcast got to see a little bit about, your journey, where it took you to the point that you decided to part ways from the church. But I've been very interested and always pleased to see the type of analysis that you bring to the issues in the church. And I've really enjoyed the way that you look at these issues. So what I'd like to do, I guess we can start out with kind of just jumping to that particular point in the video. We want to have people kind of see what it's like when we do that. I'm going to set it up here while I'm working on that. If you want to just kind of give us your thoughts about how this video hit you. We're not going to do the whole video. We're just doing that one thing. But what were your first impressions on seeing it?
Well, I have always been concerned at the very existence of LDS apologists and apologetics. To me, in a church that's directed by revelation and the leader of the church has access to God's will, it doesn't make sense that there are these unofficial people providing explanations that the leaders of the church don't provide. So when I saw these videos and watched a couple of them, I was very disturbed by the dishonesty that is manifest in them. And that's what I wanted to just rationally expose was the fallacious arguments and the dishonesty.
Yeah. And I think the way that you approach it is very good, because it's really not so much trying to demonize the messenger as much as it is just, you know, accept what their arguments are and then see if they actually stand up to kind of the standard of truth, rationality, and ethics that you can still hold on to as you leave the church. And I thought you did a brilliant job of that. But let's take a look at this clip. The system that I'm using is a little bit new. And so I haven't tested it before. Hopefully it will work sufficiently for our needs. Let me bring it up on the screen. And we're just going to play a little bit of it and see where we need to stop. So here we go. Let's give it a go.
The letter goes on to say this: the church and apologists now attempt to justify these polyandrous marriages by theorizing that they probably include sexual relations and thus were eternal or dynastic sealings only. How is not having sex with a living man's wife on earth only to take her away from him in the eternities to be one of your 40 wives any better or less immoral? Well,
okay, so you can already see a little bit of the spirit that they have for it. They're talking particularly about in the CES letter, when they talk about Joseph Smith's polygamy, they confront the rationales that are being used by current church apologists to try to minimize the kind of the problem areas of the account of Joseph Smith's polygamy. And the way that they've done that is if critics of the church have said, it seems pretty clear that Joseph Smith was using religious authority and religious notions and his own personal authority in the environment to exploit vulnerable women, which when we see that happen in the modern era, for example, the Me Too movement, generally there's a sexual element to it. They're doing it for personal gratification. And what they're doing is kind of just putting this out there and then diffusing it. Did you kind of appreciate that that's where they're going from here? Anything to add on that?
Yeah, well, what I found, you haven't played them saying it yet, was that they did not address his concern. So I don't know if you want to.
That's good to hear. Well, let's go to the next part, and then I'd like to hear you say what the actual concern is versus what they're doing, because that will play into one of the points. There's 3 points that you made on your post about this. So let's keep going a little bit here.
the ironic thing is the CES letter is atheistic and against the idea of God in general. If there's no God, then marriage is just a societal construct. Sexual ethics are based on subjective views, and there's actually nothing immoral about polygamy at all. If people are consenting, that's all that matters.
Okay. Now they've taken Jeremy Reynolds' criticism, and I feel like they're stepping back even a layer further to try to diffuse the moral position from which Jeremy is talking anyway.
Right.
How would you say?
So Jeremy was pointing out a problem that exists in their worldview, in their morality. It seems problematic, don't you think? Jeremy essentially says to say that this husband and wife and any children that they might have, they're going to love and live together in mortality, but then in the eternities, that wife and those children are going to be handed over to Joseph or some other man who will then enjoy sexual intercourse with her. And don't you think that's problematic? And instead of addressing that and explaining why that's okay and that's not a problem, they're bouncing over to what they assume to be Jeremy's worldview, where morality is subjective. And basically, as I understand what they're saying, you don't have standing to talk, Jeremy, because in your worldview, everything goes. Everything is okay. Polygamy is not a problem. So why are you even raising that issue?
Yeah. Okay, so what I really appreciate that you're pointing out is that what Jeremy's doing is pointing out a contradiction in their own moral system. And I think for me, that was a big part of it. You know, the church taught me to be honest. It taught me to respect fidelity. And these things were of the utmost. These were some core level principles that are not unique to the church. You can go and find these principles espoused by atheists or espoused by members of other faiths who don't even believe in God, and their faith is not around a notion of deity, for example, Buddhism or something like that, and they still formulate these moral principles. They're kind of universally acceptable principles, and you can talk to an evolutionary biologist or other people who would just say that this is how societies of the human organism have evolved, but they're principles that worked in societies. And so there's no reason to say that people who haven't adopted the Mormon God's version of it can't simply have those principles and hold them up, basically hold the church up to its own claims and own standards, and find that they contradict it. Because when I studied church history, I found that the use of deception, manipulation in what was clearly evident, the way Joseph Smith engaged his polygamy, was absolutely a deal breaker for me in terms of revering him as a man of God. Okay, so I want to go through the video there, and then I'd like to take a look at your points, because I thought you did a really good job of that. And did you happen to make your Facebook post public on your wall?
It's not public. I keep my Facebook posts.
Oh, that's okay.
Limited.
It's understandable. We're going to have the text of that here in just a little bit. Okay, so let's finish this, and then I'd like to kind of break it down. So, because we'll go back to this screen here. Boop. All right. Let's see if
there's no objective truth rooted in a higher power, then Jeremy Runnels' objection to polygamy is based solely on his own opinion, and in an atheistic society in which subjective views are all that matter, it would be inappropriate of him to push his marriage opinions onto others.
Basically, if there is no God, any argument against polygamy is pointless and subjective. Who cares what Jeremy Runnels thinks? As long as consent exists, polygamy is fine.
Wow. My mind almost exploded when I heard all of that. That's just amazingly dangerous thinking.
Yeah. It reminded me, there's this great show that I watched called The IT Crowd, and there's an episode there where this guy, wants to find someone who's willing to be eaten, and he's a cannibal. And as long as consent exists, then that should be okay. It turns out he has a really good TV, and so the Roy and Moss, who are the characters, really kind of want to watch a movie on a really good TV. So they consent a little bit just to go, because they want it's going to be dinner and movie and a dinner, and they get the movie part, and then they change their consent. But the issue of consent becomes very important when you come out of Mormonism, because it's a different vocabulary for moral ethics. This was brought home to me very clearly when you examine the text of the Happiness Letter, because it espouses something called divine command morality, which is an age-old philosophical problem. Is how do you define what is good and what is moral? Is what God commands good and therefore God commands it, or is what God commands good because God commands it, and anything that God commands is therefore good? And if that's the case, then if God commands slavery, if God commands genocide or anything like that, then those things become good because God commanded it. And ultimately, that just gives power into the hands of the people who claim to speak for God. Right. They get to define morality. And that's very different from a moral construct which exists apart from claims of divine sanction. And if you take your morality to be that we've worked through what is good as self-evident, and then when somebody claims God says something, you can judge those claims against that pre-existing moral framework, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over, if I can find it, to the points that you were able to very capably respond to on this. I'm going to stop sharing that screen and share a Chrome tab for this. Boop. All right. So, and maybe you can just talk us through your thinking on this. So you had a number of different points. Where you got to this point in your response was with number 10. So if you want to state how, kind of what their claim is, and then talk us through your response.
Well, so I just went ahead and assumed that everything that he said is true, which I don't think we can necessarily assume. If there is no God, then there is no objective morality. Why do you assume that? That doesn't seem as some self-evident truth to me. certainly there have been all kinds of gods worshipped throughout the course of history, and they haven't necessarily laid claim to an objective morality. So that premise is questionable. But even if we just accept it as true, this was smoke and mirrors. My point here was that you're not addressing Jeremy's concern. You're bouncing over and criticizing his worldview and trying to make it seem as if he has no standing or he's disqualified from speaking about this. That he shouldn't be worried. He shouldn't concern himself with the harmful effects of polygamy because he thinks, they assume, that morality is subjective.
So this is one of the big bugaboos, I think, that the leaders of the church have both explicitly and implicitly messaged to members in the form of general conference talks and articles, which is that if you let go, if you leave the boat, if you let go of your belief in Mormonism, then you are left to sway in the winds of the changing times, and you've lost that anchor in goodness and morality. And it's kind of really well summarized by this idea that there is no objective morality. And that's the thing, I think, that fuels the notion and the kind of the challenge that a lot of us have when we have family members that stay in the church and we leave the church, and the questions come up, how are you going to raise your children to be good people? How can I trust you? Or it's kind of like that fear that when you leave the church, suddenly you have no morals, plays into this. And there's even a dark side of it where particularly women who leave the church, sometimes find that they are secretly then propositioned by what they thought were faithful, believing members of the church into things that the church would consider to be sexually immoral. So if a man has certain sexual proclivities that he's trying to hide from his wife, he finds a young adult woman has left the church, then he'll start sending secret messages to them saying, you don't really believe in anything anyway, so why don't we have this little thing on the side?
Yeah.
This is a story that does come up frequently when you listen to women who have left the church and how they navigate the landscape that's out there. For me, leaving the church is not an act of rejection of morality. Like, in order for you to actually have the ability to say what the church has done is wrong, you have to look at the church from a moral framework, or else if you're moving to a position of no morality, then there's no reason to say anything about the church. But it is a new moral framework to some extent that you adopt after using the church's own moral framework to disassemble the church in and of itself. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Excellent point. That's absolutely true. It was my love of the truth as my top moral value that allowed me to begin to question and to recognize that the church has been dishonest. And so the church was not consistent with my morals, and I couldn't support it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, if you, in studying church history, learn that Joseph Smith did the things that he did. He promised salvation for a young 14-year-old girl's family if she would consent to enter into an exclusive, mature adult relationship with him. Whether or not there was sexuality involved in that, there is an impropriety and a power imbalance that we would see as a form of ecclesiastical abuse if Russell M. Nelson were to make such a proposal to a 14-year-old today. And those, as much as the church tries to state that its position is this unswaying moral principles,
right,
you just have to ask your question. If today's prophets did the things that those past prophets did, would it still be considered moral? And is there any world in which it would be moral? And that's where kind of you realize that Joseph Smith did actually infuse his religious ethic with something that would justify that. But then you're faced with the question of, are you going to accept that religious moral ethic? And I can share kind of where that, to me, is most concisely articulated from the church. And to find that, you would just need to go to the Joseph Smith Papers Project and take a look at the various different places where they have included the happiness letter. And and you can see that in the context of this letter, there's a 19-year-old daughter of Sidney Rigdon that he made a proposal of what is essentially secret, illegal bigamy / polygamy to her, and she rejected it because it violated her understanding of the moral norms that were being taught in public. And that's because Joseph at this time had a secret doctrine of polygamy that was a violation of what was being taught publicly. But in order to rationalize that, he used some examples. In particular, he said, God said, "Thou shalt not kill." At another time, he said, "Thou shalt utterly destroy." This is the principle on which the government of heaven is conducted. So right there, he's saying there's two conflicting commandments coming from God, but since they're both from God, they're good. And it's by revelation adapted to the circumstances in which the children of the kingdom are placed. Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reasons of till long after the events transpire. That particular statement right there, that whatever God requires is right, no matter whatever, no matter what it is, that is the justification that religious charlatans have used since time immemorial to exploit their followers and to gain sexual gratification, to justify murder, to justify violence and theft. It is kind of it's the main air that religious authoritarians breathe, which is that I have a special connection to God. I can tell you what to do and you will do it because of that connection to God, because it comes from God, and that is what defines what is good. So is that objective morality or is that subjective morality? Where would you, how do you tease apart what is objective morality compared with subjective morality in that context?
Yeah, so to me, if a Mormon claims that, hey, morality is objective and absolute and eternal, which in a sense they do claim, they try to teach that. We have there in Joseph Smith's handwriting that's not what he believed. It's if you step down from whatever God says is right, then it changes all over the place. We can kill, we can murder, we commit genocide, and then we don't kill. Murder is wrong. And so in the canonized scriptures, in the words of Latter-day Prophets, I don't see any consistent rule being applied except follow the prophet, follow the prophet, follow the prophet. And the prophets bounced around all over the place. And now we know the prophets, they get it wrong. They're products of their time. And so, okay, then just acknowledge that you don't have any claim special relationship to morality, and you don't present an objective morality. But that's very ingrained in what they have to cling to, that idea that you leave the church and you become evil, and the only place you can develop as a person and become good is within the church and by obeying the dictates of its leaders.
Okay, that brings up a good point, which is I want to acknowledge some things about this mode of argument. Why does this argument work for people who are in the church? Why is this effective for the church to use to try to close people off to the message that comes from Jeremy Reynolds or other people? And I think the most charitable thing that I would like to start with, and I'll see your take on it, is that people in the church are genuinely good, in that they want to see themselves as good. They want to, I think that the impulse to be compassionate towards other people is very inherent to them. And it resonates with them. And so since the church is defining what's good, that's gonna I don't know, that's what appeals to them in that mindset. What is your take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's good people in the church, and the church teaches some good principles. There's no question about that. I think there's many factors that play into the demonization of apostates and critics. A big one, the one that comes to my mind, is the idea that the church is the one and only true church. So if somebody on the outside of the church has some different moral framework, that cannot be valid. Because if that's valid and it is inconsistent with the church's moral framework, then the narrative breaks down that we are the one and only true church. I remember in Fast and Testimony meetings as a member, a believing member, saying and hearing from other peoples many times in my life that I don't know where I would be without the church. You're made to be completely dependent. You're made to be fearful. You're made to think that you'd be curled up in the fetal position in an irrigation ditch, drunk and unemployed without the church. And it's just not the case.
No. I heard somebody say, what, on this argument of can you be good and moral without an appeal to religious authority? And a very easy to understand representation of that is, do you like Sesame Street? You can watch Sesame Street and you can learn all about the value of friendship, of cooperation, of compassion, of looking out for your neighbor. You can learn all of those things, and there's not one single reference made to God. And there's no appeal to religious authority as the source of those principles. They stand on their own as universally acceptable principles. And I think for me, that's a great starting point for it. But it's interesting. I think there's this question of how you can see yourself as a good person is very important, because religions themselves, I think a lot of their power is gained from providing the narrative that allows people to see themselves as good people. I think that's a very human need. And when you leave the church, you have to do so on a new moral framework that allows you to continue to see yourself as a good person. And I think that's part of where we get hurt with these type of apologetic things, is because ultimately what they're saying to us is that in leaving the church, we are not good people, we are bad people. And it's very easy to tie that message to the idea that we're servants of Satan. And there's a narrative about the great conflict of life that is infused throughout Mormonism, that us versus them, inside versus outside thinking that you described, that fuels the fear that people who are spiritually dependent upon religious authority for their moral outlook is very real, and it's very visceral. And it's the same type of mindset that keeps people trapped in any authoritative religious paradigm. For me, the way that was diffused was really before I could criticize Joseph, before any of these things, I really did have to develop a new moral framework that was outside of religious authority. And for me, that came slowly. I was a physician in the military. We were in the middle of all of our conflicts in the Middle East. And, some people started making the case that what we were doing by interfering in the sovereignty of other governments, other peoples across the world, was inherently immoral. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And so I had the opportunity to explore other ways of looking at the issue of morality and ethics. And in particular, the non-aggression principle was something that I found was a brilliant way to articulate a moral worldview that was not dependent on religious authority, because I saw how religious authority had failed, particularly when you look at the history of World War II. There were Mormon Nazis. The Mormon prophet did not have the prescience to condemn that the worldview of Nazism and and to see what was coming down the pipe. And so that for me was the moral foundation that once I started to develop those things, when I then re-examined what the prophets said, I could hold them up to an external framework of morality and ethics and say, no, that's not right. Did you experience any sort of new formulation of moral ethics? Because when I say that I went through that, some of the same principles still applied. Honesty is still applicable from that moral framework. So even though the church taught honesty, things that the church teaches that are universal moral principles always come with a caveat, which we've alluded to already, which is that the one unchanging moral principle, which makes it the only moral principle in Mormonism, is to obey church authority. Because church authority can change any other moral principle and pervert it with a higher, that higher authority. So what was your own journey in terms of rooting your morality in something other than religious dictate?
So many people derive utility from the church, and there's some real value there that people find in their lives, and I experienced some of that. But for me, the veracity or the truthfulness of it was always the most important thing. So in my journey, I think that there was a simplification of my values. It wasn't that I abandoned everything and discarded it. I believe that humans settle moral questions based on their context, their cultural, social, scientific, and other contexts. And so my values are the truth and not harming other people, or non-aggression, as you were saying. And with those values, I settle moral questions. I guess seeing the dishonesty, as I said before, that's what allowed me to recognize that I'm prepared to let go of this other moral framework that I have held on to my entire life. You mentioned Sesame Street earlier. We've been talking about the fear that's created Sesame Street as a way to learn morality independent of moral authority and belief in God. And in the LDS Church, it's one of the things that I find arrogant and reprehensible is not only do, on the one hand, they paint apostates as evil, they also take credit or try to take credit for all of the good that everybody in the world does, whether they're in the church or out of the church. They say, oh, that was the light of Christ operating in them and causing them to do those things. So recently, Russell M. Nelson says that a life without God is a life full of fear, and a life with God is a life full of peace. And so I've gotten to some Facebook discussions with people about how, that's not true. I'm not living my life full of fear. And several people wouldn't allow that possibility. In other words, I say I'm living without God in the world and I'm not fearful, and they're like, no, he gives you breath day to day, like he hasn't abandoned you. Like you can't win. They claim all the good. They claim the peace that you experience in your life. Pretty frustrating.
Yeah. Well, it starts out with that, but then they claim the good that you have, but then they claim that they have a greater good, that if you were just in the in club, then you would get, it's kind of like you could be sitting there enjoying a piece of chocolate. This is really good chocolate. And then they'll come up to me like, oh, you enjoy that chocolate, huh? We gave you that chocolate. We made it possible in the world. But if you want, you're not really enjoying the chocolate. If you want the real chocolate, you got to come and do the things that we got to do. It's just like, they don't even let you exist without that. Okay, so let's take a look at your second point on this, because I think there's more that we could say about that. So let me bring our screen up, and we'll go down to your second point. In an atheistic society in which subjective views are all that matter, it would be inappropriate for Jeremy Runnels to push his marriage opinions onto others. What do you say to that?
Well, I pointed out several things there. It's again, it's the continuation of the red herring. So we're off track from what Jeremy was actually saying.
So specifically, they're saying that Jeremy Reynolds is trying to push his marriage opinions onto others when he's
right.
not.
Yeah,
He's trying to point out the inconsistency in the idea that, oh, well, Joseph was just marrying people for time on earth, and then he was going to claim them in the eternities.
right.
And it's like, what's the point of that? And other people will point out, Joseph didn't, he got sealed to like all these other women first. He didn't even get sealed to his own kids. So what was the point of that?
Yeah. So that whole apologetic argument doesn't get very far. Yeah, so it's a straw man, it's a red herring, it's also the tu quoque logical fallacy where you meet criticism with criticism rather than actually addressing the criticism. But then the statement itself is just false. In an atheistic society where we recognize that morality is subjective, it's inappropriate for Jeremy Reynolds to push his marriage opinions on others. Well, says who? I'm an atheist, and I do think that morality is subjective, and I don't think that that means that I cannot and should not advocate for morality as I understand it and as I believe it. So, for example, I would oppose female genital mutilation. I would advocate for that to be illegal. That's me imposing my subjective morality, and I recognize that that's subjective. That's me imposing my subjective morality on others. So I just disagree with the premise. But then that's not even what Jeremy is doing. He's not advocating to have his marriage opinions imposed on others.
Yeah. Now, they would probably say, well, no. By criticizing the church, he's basically saying that it's not okay, in this case, for Joseph Smith to enter into these sealings. But I agree, it's kind of a misrepresentation of his perspective. He's just saying that this, the way that Joseph Smith went about it betrayed the very notion that people have free agency, or that, the criticisms that people have, well, it's just for sexual gratification. Well, there's many different reasons that religious authoritarians will do what they do. Sexual gratification is one of them. Control, authority. You can look at any other religious charlatan that has used their religious position to exploit people in their group, and you can find many different themes under which they do that. But it's very simplistic to simply just say that, well, if you're an atheist, you can't really say anything because morality is all subjective.
Yeah, and then they're trying to solve their problem, the problem with their worldview in what they believe to be Jeremy's worldview.
Okay, let's see here. Systems of morality that embrace racism, sexism, and violence are, for example, to be resisted. My belief in subjective morality doesn't mean that I believe my morality should be imposed on everybody else, but it doesn't mean that I can't and shouldn't advocate for others to adopt my system of morality. I think this is kind of the societal conundrum that we're all faced with, and that is that the reality is that our moral principles and ideas are the result, they come through the result of discourse, or our society interacting with each other, making the case for different ways of thinking about things. And it's a conversation that continues to go on. And that's where, as a society, we can see ourselves move from a mindset in the 19th century where slavery was considered to be just and moral. Right. And there were people who saw the problem with that and started to speak out against it, even using the vocabulary of religion itself. They could find little gems of universal humanity within religious texts, within spiritual beliefs at that time, and use them to communicate and to make their moral persuasive arguments at the time. And that existed in the wider Christian world here in North America. It exists on other issues throughout the world. So even the claim that a belief in God somehow roots you in an objective morality denies the reality that that morality is subjective. And there are things that if you just look at our species as a social species and things that evolutionarily impart advantage, things like cooperation give a tribe or a group a competitive advantage for the use and acquisition of resources. And so it, just like you would see if you study other social creatures, the principle of cooperation, which involves looking out for something other than just yourself, imparts an evolutionary advantage. So to have that then evolve as part of the human society is a understandable thing. And just how we deal with that and how we work with each other, I think, is part of the questions that are part of maturing spiritually, if you want to call it spiritual, or morally when you leave the church. When you let go of that authority, you have to start to engage the conversation, because before you let go of simply surrendering your moral agency to this religious authority, you never really have to work through these issues. All you ever have to say is, what did the brethren say?
Right.
But when you let go of that, suddenly you have to start to wrestle with these issues and figure out where your principles are based on. And it is a conversation, and things that you think are fine now, in the future, you may find that it's not fine. This is actually, ironically, one of the points that they make in the video, but is actually a good point. But it's not an argument that says that you can't look back and find problems. It's just an argument that really calls you to a point of humility in considering your positions these days.
Excellent points. Yeah, I mean, so the charge that an atheistic society is like everybody gone wild implies that in a theistic society, everything's orderly and right and good. Yeah. Interesting claim. Belief in what God? The God of the Aztecs, where the moral imperative was human sacrifice? The God of the Bible, who commanded genocide, and the moral imperative was also to kill witches and homosexuals and disrespectful children? The God of Vishnu, Brahma, like what God is it that has this objective morality? And show me the evidence that is a thing, and I just don't see it. I would also point out humans have been very egocentric, thinking often in religious frameworks that the universe exists for us. And I think that what we're coming to realize, and what I believe, is that we are animals just like every other animal. We have a common ancestor with chickens. We have a common ancestor with fish. And so we have our notion of morality. What about the morality of these other animals? Do we think that female black widow spiders are evil because they consume their male mates after reproducing? Are chickens immoral because they have a pecking order? And what was the morality of our common ancestor? Like, science has demonstrated quite clearly that there was no Adam and Eve. There was no first male and female human. And so it's quite clear to me that human morality is a human construct, and it has changed, and it will change. The things that we think are evil today may be deemed the moral imperative tomorrow. Things that we think are virtuous today may be viewed as reprehensible tomorrow. And in our present time, we can accept that, we can recognize that, and in our context, we can say, these are the things that are good and evil. And we can also recognize that, I think, as you noted earlier, there's some universally accepted values, or generally universally accepted values, but there are also some matters of morality that I can recognize. I have an opinion on it, but my opinion is not the opinion, and so not everything is black and white, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, and not all moral questions are of equal weight.
Yeah, I think that the classic conundrum comes, you know, if the Nazis come knocking on your door and ask you if you have, you know, if you've seen Anne Frank. And so then you have to weigh now, well, I believe in telling the truth, but there's also, you know, what do you do in the face of, you know, a greater moral atrocity? And that's where there is this hierarchy of values, and that some may have to be, you know, secondary to others. And that hierarchy is one that the church exploits, because when we talk about how there's really only one moral principle, which is obey the prophets, what that's just saying is that the church has inserted that value at the top of the hierarchy of values, which then can subsume all others at any point based on the whims of the religious authority. And when you reject a particular religion, you're simply taking that out of the equation so that you can start to move forward as a moral agent without having to surrender that bit of yourself. And so when we talk about these early people who rejected slavery, for example, my favorite one is William Lloyd Garrison, because he was born within a couple of weeks of Joseph Smith. And at the same time that Joseph Smith is doing some things which continue to reinforce religious justification for lower standing for Black people, William Lloyd Garrison is rejecting those religious ideas and promoting a more universal brotherhood narrative for seeing all people as God's children. And so I see the reason that somebody like William Lloyd Garrison or Stuart Udall or Lowry Nelson, who are big names when you go and research church history on who spoke out first against the problems with the church's attitude towards Black people, they were able to do that because they did not subvert those moral principles of universal humanity and love for religious authority. And it's one of those stumbling stones in terms of being able to actually pursue a moral character that is free of deception and manipulation. If you have that religious authority there, it's a big problem. Now, I don't really hold the position that that religion is in and of itself a absolute bad. And I think that it depends on the way that your religion interacts with your conscience and your agency. And there are religions out there that allow you to center your moral agency within yourself. And that's a position that allows this type of progress to happen as an individual when you make your way through the moral conversation of, you know, life, humanity, and society. And that's kind of where we move into the bugaboo of not so much moral relativism, but atheism itself. There are a host of people who reject Joseph Smith and reject Mormonism, but continue to see themselves as spiritual or even religious and find some other moral paradigm for them. The fact that they do that doesn't invalidate their criticisms of Joseph Smith and what he, you know, comes to represent. Now, how do you've said before you're explicitly an atheist and no belief in God, like how do you deal with people who are former Mormons but continue to consider themselves Christian or subscribe to other religious paradigm?
How do I deal with them? I try to be kind. That's actually one of the things that really surprised me when I left the church and did the Mormon Stories interview and kind of was engaging with a lot of different people on Facebook and on YouTube. I fully anticipated opposition from believing members of the church, but then I also found that there was a lot of opposition and criticism of some of the things that I said that came from never Mormon Christians or from ex-Mormons who landed in Christianity. I feel like the same tools that allowed me to recognize that my beliefs were unfounded and false within the church, when I applied those tools to the Bible and to other religious belief systems, I found that I didn't see the evidence to support a belief. And so I concluded I'm open to evaluating evidence as it comes in, but I don't see evidence that persuades me to believe in a deity. And I resolved that I I'm not going to be duped again. I'm not going to adopt an unfounded belief. I don't know exactly if that answered your question or.
No, I think it is. I mean, for me, one of the big issues that I noticed is that when you leave Mormonism, there is a whole host of people who are ready to fill your empty vessel with a new religious paradigm. And it's really, I think, groups that capture people in prisons of belief look for vulnerable people, and leaving Mormonism is a particularly vulnerable point in your life because you're still trying to figure out what the world is. You've been painted, a whole picture of the world has been painted for you, and it's really hard to know that. Now, for me, part of that was I had an idea of what religion was because of what the church was and what the church told me the wide world of religion is. And a great deal of what they told me was true, and that is that there are deceptive, predatory religious people out there that will exploit you and use lies and deception. That totally exists out there. It just happened to also exist in the Mormon Church. They just
right. They didn't tell me that part.
Yeah. But what that closed me off to, though, was the different modes and framework of religious being, where there can be people coming together under the banner of religion who see it much more not as the source of their life force or their worldview as much as it is a companion of shared values and a way that they can connect with other people in that heading. And there was a really good cartoon that I want to share here from The Naked Pastor that I think articulates how I've encountered other types of religious paradigms. And let me bring that up. Here we go. All right. And so this is a cartoon from the Naked Pastor. And it's basically, it has a Christ figure talking to modern religionists. And it says, the difference between me and you is you use scripture to determine what love means, and I use love to determine what scripture means. And what he's pointing to is that hierarchy of values that we talked about, where once you let go of the idea that your religious authority is what defines morality, then you form your own moral character, your own moral foundation. And then you can look at religion, at relationships, at politics, at every other aspect of your life against that standard. And so I can see how it is possible for people to still participate in a religious society, but hold their own moral character. I think in some instances, particularly because just of the pitfalls of power and authority and human nature, that can turn into something that becomes unhealthy. And so it's one of those things that I approach with trepidation, but it's, I think, allowed me to continue to connect with and feel resonant with other people that continue to practice religion. There's a local Lutheran church that my family has participated in their community outreach program, which is essentially just a way for me to be in Broadway style shows and do different silly voices and stuff. And it's great. And it cultivates the community. It helps young people still to continue to share that sense of community. When you leave the church, there's a reality that you do lose a lot of the benefit of things that have developed over time that we as humans need. And part of that is community and shared purpose and narrative. It really brings to mind Toy Story. When Buzz finally accepts that he's not a space captain and that, he's a toy. And that all the things, all his entire world, his entire story about who he was and his purpose in it and the value of who he was is taken away from him. And there's the scene where he's like pretending to drink and he's there with he's like, there's no purpose. All those years of academy training wasted. It's like he has no purpose. And the story of his life at that point is nil. I mean, he doesn't see any value in it. And I think all of us that have gone through this transition have had to wrestle with that idea. If we are not gods in embryo, what's our point? You know, and that is where the real journey begins, where you have to then start to find value and beauty and worth in the world around you on terms that aren't based in religion or divine decree. And you have to start finding the story for yourself. What is your story? What is the character that you are in your life? And because it's through that story, through that narrative, that you find meaning, that you find purpose. And it's really that purpose that drives you and makes life worth living. And this is just one of the things that I think gives me a great deal more compassion for people who stay in the church or find themselves in other religious paradigms, because they have a story and it's meaningful to them. And so if you're, you know, part of that maturity that you achieve growing out of the church is how you approach finding your own story and your own narrative. And it's hard and it's tough. And some people can get lost and not find a way to connect with meaning. And that's a dangerous thing for people to be in sometimes.
Absolutely. And that the comic you showed, I recognize that not all religions have the same level of control over people's lives. They don't all subvert people's own moral authority, as you were talking about. And it's that subversion that results in an obstacle to moral progress or adaptability. Well, Joseph Smith said that God said this.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of stuck with that, because if we repudiate that, what does that mean about Joseph Smith or God? We can't repudiate that. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has moved on, and people who are stuck with this subverted moral authority, where they hand it over to the church, they hand it over to an ancient text, or even like a modern text. The morality often grows stale and outdated before the ink has dried, and it's just not healthy. But you made several good points there. Absolutely, there's community. There's certainly value that organized religious people have brought to the world. No doubt about that.
Just trying to recreate the good of a religious life without reproducing the bad is a hard thing. Let's go to your next point. I think your last point on this particular video. Let me see if I can bring it up here by sharing the screen. And all right, so this is a longer one, but you made some powerful points here. So their argument is, if there is no God, then any argument against polygamy is pointless. And your response was brilliant on this. Really? Let's test this out. If there is no God, then any argument against murder is pointless. If there is no God, then any argument against gang raping infants is pointless. If there is no God, then any argument against lying, violence, physical abuse, and torture is pointless.
Yeah. And that's all part of the fear mongering, I think, that and the discrediting of apostates and critics of the church. You have no moral standing, and this I thought was extremely dangerous thinking. I don't think that they actually believe what they said, but they did say it. And if that's what they really believe, then I think they need to stay very much rooted to their moral system, where murder is wrong, for example, because holy cow, if you lose belief in God, and that means that nothing is wrong, I don't want to be walking down the street next to you.
Yeah, it brings to mind that meme from Penn Jillette, I think, which was, or I forget his name, but one of the Penn and Teller characters has been an outspoken atheist, and he's like, you know, people tell me that if you leave religion, you're going to go out and rape people. He's like, well, I rape all the people I want, which is zero.
Right,
like
every day.
Church, yeah. You know, that doesn't mean that suddenly you become this demonic creature, but it does mean that you do start to violate moral proprietary moral boundaries that exist within a religious paradigm. So that depends on your religious paradigm. So if you're Jehovah's Witness, it means that you may go out and start celebrating your birthday.
Right.
It may mean that, you know, you go out and you vote, or that you pursue higher education, because all of those things are moral prescriptions in that paradigm.
Right.
And if you're Mormon, what are you going to do if you're Mormon and you go out and you start sinning?
Right. You might fall in love with somebody of a different race and want to marry them. Who knows what might happen then?
Yeah. You know, and I think particularly in Mormonism, you know, pre-1978 and even after 1978, that was still considered some, you know, a failing. Or you may drink coffee, or you may decide to love and accept your homosexual son or daughter who, you know, pursue that path in life. So there's all sorts of issues that come up with this, but
and that was only half of the point there. I mean, that's totally flawed thinking to say if there is no God, then any argument against XYZ is pointless.
Yeah.
We're specifically talking about polygamy. There are actually, I think, quite strong arguments against polygamy, and I think it's inherently problematic. This stems from, first, the fact that men and women are born into the world in roughly equal proportions. So if we have any kind of system that locks up the sexuality of several women for every one man, we're creating winners and losers. And that creates a pressure for those women who will be increasingly rare to be married younger and younger. It creates
out again and again in any polygamous society,
right,
where you get the lost boy phenomenon.
yes.
And that is that the younger men have fewer and fewer peer-aged women that they could actually be marriage or relationship tied to, because the women have all been acquired and amassed by the people who were dominant in the society at the time that polygamy was instituted.
Yeah, and so to fix the imbalance, you've got to kick out some men or some young men, as you're saying. And then further, it smacks in the face of our current sensibilities of sexual equality, or equality of the sexes, where you're creating this unequal relationship between husband and wife. So those are a few, I think, arguments against polygamy that have nothing to do with the existence of God.
Right. So being able to make a non-religious, secular, moral, although moral argument against something like polygamy that Joseph Smith has done is part of that spiritual maturity. And I think all of us that see the problems with this go on. Now, then how do you explain the fact that in any given ex-Mormon community, you're going to find people espousing the values and virtues of polyamory? And because that's kind of part of the bugaboo that I think Mormonism has, is that, well, if you leave, you're just going to become some sort of sexual deviant. You're polyamory. Well, if you're going to be polyamorous, then there's no problem with being polygamous.
Well, I think that polyamory is it's different than polygamy. You could have a moral system where there's not monogamy, but you're not creating this imbalance between men and women. And I think that addresses some of the issues that I mentioned with polygamy. But you're right. It's the slippery slope argument. Like, what's next? You're going to marry donkeys? Are you going to have a relationship with your dog? Where do you draw the line? And apparently they're comfortable with drawing it at polygamy.
Well, and that brings up an important point of how they define, and their defense of this whole issue is rooted in consent and the notion of consent. And I think that maybe they are misrepresenting the arrangement that happened, or they have a limited perspective on what actually constitutes consent. And I think you allude to this in some of the other parts of your post there, but what was your take on how they seem to be projecting that they understand consent?
Oh, well, I don't think that a 14-year-old can consent to marriage, let alone a marriage to a 37-year-old man, 23 years her senior, who is the religious leader in her community, that her family would be shunned and ostracized if she crossed him. There's this power imbalance. There's no way she could have given consent, as I understand it. And many people will say, oh, presentism. You're trying to apply your values and your standards retroactively to this, this different time. And they misrepresent what the standards of that day actually were. But even still, even if somehow the standards of Joseph Smith's day allowed for that, like it was a normal practice, I still have a problem with it, because God was the one whispering in Joseph's ear, supposedly, sending angels to threaten him with death if he didn't do these things. And since when did God kind of care what human societal norms are? Yeah. Like, God wouldn't, if it's not okay today for a 14-year-old to give consent, or not possible for a 14-year-old to give consent in that situation, that's not different just because society accepts it in Joseph's day. So God would have, if it's all as Joseph claims, he would have said, hey, that's disgusting. That's a no-no. You got to stay away from Helen Mar Kimball. And that's my take on that. She couldn't have given consent.
And even if you adopt the church's position that, well, Joseph Smith, you know, he knew what the goal was, and he made some mistakes in doing it. Well, we have plenty of opportunities to see where Joseph Smith documented where God whispered into his ear on urgent things. I mean, you can go and look at the Joseph Smith Papers website. My favorite one is at the meeting of the town city council voting to who was going to replace John C. Bennett as mayor. And there were only a few names tossed into the hat, one of which was Joseph Smith. But who was it, like Heber Kimball or Sarah Kimball's husband, who was not a member of the church. And Sarah had been recently propositioned for secret illegal bigamy, and she rejected Joseph. Well, Joseph Smith has a revelation. God tells him, like, he's sitting in the room. He writes down on a piece of paper, hey, God, thus saith the Lord, that Kimball guy is saying bad things about you, and he needs to shut up or else he'll be smitten. You know, he takes it and he tosses it across the room, and that's a revelation. So clearly God is going to reveal to him something when things are wrong. And yet we have these stories of women who, and you know, Helen Mar Kimball, you could say, okay, well, she's the daughter of Heber Kimball, or I'm getting these Kimballs messed up, but you know, and so that's fine. But you could even look at people who were the foster children of Joseph, who depended on him absolutely for their living. Their parents had been sent away or died, and he was essentially their guardian, their stewardship. And Mormons would be, you know, they would in glee, you know, deride Woody Allen for entering into a relationship with his foster child.
Castrate him, off with his head.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, when Joseph Smith does this, and you can hear Lucy Walker in her testimony later in the Temple Lot trial just say, you know, it was like devastating for me to have this man propose to me, and you know, he wrote me a letter and said burn it because it was going to be kept secret. But you know, these are things that when you re-encounter them, you can say, you know, if Mormonism does claim that its morality comes from God, what was God doing back in that time, commanding these things and allowing these things? And your moral worldview has to become Baroque in its ornateness in order to accommodate all these different, you know, conflicting things that you have to account for. Or you could say, wait a second, he was a religious charlatan who employed the voice of God to get power, sexual access, influence, and control over the people around him. And so he made it up. And that one allowance, which you would make for any other religious charlatan, be it L. Ron Hubbard or anyone else, you would say, oh yeah, he just made it up so he could get control over people. Well, you just make that one allowance and it simplifies the entire situation with Joseph Smith.
Yeah, I've heard people say in an apologetic way, there's simplicity on the other side of complexity. Meaning the complexity of the mental gymnastics and everything that you have to work through to make these things work. And in this FAIRMormon video, they made a similar claim. That was one of their conclusions is, hey, we just don't know. Like Joseph's polygamy, it was so complicated. We don't know. And so Jeremy Reynolds is making this way too simple. And as you said, it's actually extremely simple. If you don't start with the conclusion that that the truth claims that Joseph Smith made are valid. If you don't start with that conclusion and you just follow the evidence, it's very simple. He was a charlatan.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see here. I want to go to something that I encountered a few years ago on the question of atheist morals. And this was a list of, it's kind of like how Judeo-Christian morality, for a long time, people summed it up with like the 10 Commandments as a starting point or some framework in which to start from. And this was posted on Reddit a few years ago. It took some sleuthing to find out where it came from, but it's a list of values and principles that an atheist could claim to guide them in their life. And so if somebody says, well, atheist morality is subjective, well, here's a list of principles that somebody can hold without having to believe in God. The first one is an atheist loves his fellow man instead of God. An atheist believes that heaven is something for which we should work now, here on earth, for all men together to enjoy. An atheist believes that he can get no help through prayer, but they must find in themselves the inner conviction and strength to meet life, to grapple with it, to subdue it, and enjoy it. An atheist believes that only in the knowledge of themselves and knowledge of their fellow man can they find the understanding that will help to a life of fulfillment. An atheist seeks to know themselves and their fellow man rather than to know God. An atheist believes that a hospital should be built instead of a church. An atheist believes that a deed must be done instead of a prayer said. An atheist strives for involvement in life and not escape into death. An atheist wants disease conquered, poverty vanquished, war eliminated. An atheist wants man to understand and love man. Atheist wants an ethical way of life. An atheist believes that we cannot rely on a God or channel action into prayer, nor hope for an end of troubles in a hereafter. An atheist believes that we are our brother's keeper and are keepers of our own lives, that we are responsible persons and the job is here and the time is now. Now, when I first came across those, it gave me, a lot to consider just in terms of those ideas. I think even a religious person, if they let go of this need that they have, that other people who want to be good have to believe in God and have to believe in not just God, but their version of God, and just say, can we let people be good on their own terms for their own purposes? Then it should be very easy for even a Christian to relate to an atheist who would say that they subscribe to those principles and say, you know what, that's good. I'd be happy to work alongside you towards those ends. And I feel like if Mormonism understood that the people that leave their faith are still good people, then it wouldn't be making videos like this.
Yeah.
Because of how denigrating they are to the mind and conscience of people that leave. Have you ever come across that list before?
I think I have. So many people that I've interacted with have claimed that atheism is a religion, and I have to push back on that every single time. It's a lack of belief. I simply lack belief in a supernatural or any other kind of deity. And so lacking belief there is no moral imperative. It doesn't tell me what I should value or I should believe. That list certainly sounded like a bunch of good values and things that I can endorse. But my atheism does not compel me to be good. It doesn't compel me to be bad. It doesn't compel me to serve others or to harm others. And I think that that's really important to help religious people understand that that's what atheism is, because if atheism is a religion, then all of a sudden we're on equal footing. Then all of a sudden the burden of proof is on me to justify my belief, when it's not actually a belief, it's a lack of belief in a deity. So I hope that makes sense. Absolutely, atheists can be moral people, but I maintain that there is no atheist creed. There is no atheist dogma. And therefore, there are no atheist murders. There are no atheist genocides. The lack of belief in deity makes no moral imperative on the atheist.
Okay, so now let's explore something about this. So this list comes from the opening statements in the court case which ended school prayer, a compelled school prayer and Bible study, and it was part of the arguments of it was actually a woman who was the voice of the American atheists, or subsequently became that, and when you read it, it elevates this principle of looking out for other people. And I think this ties into a little bit of some deep Mormon fears about communism, because it's a very common thing, if you grew up in the Ezra Taft Benson era, for you to say, well, atheists are communists. And the woman who came out with this was, in fact, a communist. And the thing is, she took these atheist principles and she elevated them to a dogma and said, well, then if I believe that we should all be looking out for other people for an element, then that should now infuse and become a dogma that I now act out politically. And so this is kind of one of those things where you have to struggle when you do encounter the wide world of beliefs outside of Mormonism. There's going to be a tremendous variety of them, and you're going to find that it leads people to act politically. And so, we're all fans of demonizing Nazis. You don't hear as much about demonizing communism, even though Nazis, they killed like 6 to 8 million Jews, and whereas communism in Russia killed 24 million people, and in China something like 40 to 50 million people. And so they're built on, each of those things was not simply a strong religious or a strong political leader in power. It was a strong political leader at the front of a philosophical movement that was rooted in ideas. And the acceptance and the espousement of those ideas was not, hey, let's kill 20 million people. It was, hey, let's look out for everybody. Let's do these things. And so the fears that, in the 20th century, when the world was seeing different competing political ideas that were fueled by philosophies that were intermingled with things that people can also root in religion, it becomes a very complex landscape. And that's one of the things that I think we all have to wrestle with, because a lot of the things that we enjoy in enlightened Western civilization found a lot of their resonance and maybe came to the stage or allowed to flourish because they piggybacked on religious thinkers who were rooted in Judeo-Christian philosophy. And so I think that's why when you listen to people who are taking this in a totally different area, if you listen to Jordan Peterson, who's very frequently demonized and said to be a religious apologist in and of himself, when you look at how he discusses these issues, the philosophies behind religion and politics are intermingled. And one of the things that I'm trying to be wary of is throwing out certain aspects of the baby with the bathwater in how I look at the world going forward. And that's why, for me, for the church in defense of themselves to demonize moral relativity and atheism as these paired bugaboos is really difficult. I don't consider myself an atheist. I don't really talk about my own beliefs on this channel because I don't think my role is to tell people how to believe. I really want these conversations to be centered around, what are the different ways that we can challenge our own beliefs and come up with a moral framework and a character for ourselves that comes from that struggle, from that own internal, dialogue. And so it's going to be different for me as it is for you. And some of the principles that I think are essential is our ability to listen and tolerate different perspectives, even if we don't agree with them, and to challenge ourselves when we hear them. And for me, that's part of the difficulty with the moment we find ourselves in, where certain ideas are met with what is called cancel culture, where we use some of the social justice mob reaction to silence views or to deplatform views. And for me, I think that that's a real regression in some of the best principles that our Western society has in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of belief. And so that's kind of, I guess, my end thoughts on that.
Yeah. Lost my thought. I hear what you're saying. I very often engaging in people in these discussions on Facebook. My purpose is to challenge unfounded, demonstrably false, and harmful beliefs and practices. It's not to convert everybody to my way of thinking, but many people, once I've challenged their unfounded, demonstrably false, or harmful belief, they'll ask me, well, what do you believe? And I'm hesitant to share my beliefs, because then it's just a comparison of belief systems based on their preconceived notions about what atheism, for example, what the merits and virtues or horrors of atheism are. And then it kind of shuts down the discussion, or it shifts the discussion from what we were talking about, and it ends their exploration of whether their ideas are founded, demonstrably false, or harmful.
No,
So I hear what you're saying there.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, a lot of it is just like discovering the principle of falsifiability, just in terms of, you want to be able to act on real things in your life. And so the idea of what is true and what is false, what is a mistaken belief or a delusion, and what is something rooted in reality, those become very, very important, because you can only make decisions based on the information that you have, and you want that information to be reliable. And so, once you shift your perspective on what information is reliable to blind trust in a religious authority, meaning that you don't challenge anything that they say, you don't question it or push back against it to see if it is on anything firm, to a mode where you do have to challenge things, because the only way you can know things is to try to disprove them and have it survive that attempt at disproof. It's such a core fundamental shift in the way that you approach issues in your life, and it affects not only religion but other aspects of your life. Was it Karl Popper was the philosopher that first articulated that principle of falsifiability, and it was one of the important, I think, landmarks in developing my own way of looking at the world. But even this thing that you talk about, there's this like activist element to leaving Mormonism that infuses us, and there's a degree of hubris in that too. Well, I know the way things are supposed to be. I know what's wrong with the way you think, and so I'm going to challenge you on it and get you to move on it. And so I try not to be an arrogant blowhard, but I totally am. I know it.
I've been accused of that, and my mission is not to like bring down all religion. I don't know if you others have been watching the Netflix Scientology documentary with Leah Remini, but the parallels are amazing. And one of the things that was said on that show is that Scientology creates the people who leave Scientology. Scientology creates like an army of people that really dislike Scientology. And it's that same kind of thing. Like, Scientologists leave the church, but they leave Scientology, but they can never leave it alone. And somebody who's trapped inside Scientology cannot understand. They don't get it. And members of the church, I think, who are still experiencing the utility of the church, who haven't been exposed to the problems, they look out at the activism of many of the people who leave, and because of the message that they're receiving inside the church, it actually bolsters their faith. It's this backfire effect. It's evidence of the truthfulness of the message inside the church, that Satan is controlling these people and they're just fighting so hard to bring it down. When actually, if you are being defrauded and you discover the fraud, why in the world would you walk away and continue to let your friends and family be defrauded? You would raise your voice. That would be the moral thing to do. But when you're trapped inside, you don't see it, you can't understand it.
And there's something to be said also, though, for existing in a religious paradigm that is always demanding of you, demanding time, demanding action, demanding proselytizing, and letting go of that, and then just reclaiming your time and your life for yourself with, not having to do that. And that's where it's kind of like, I want other people to be okay just doing whatever they want to serve their values and their interests. It bristles me a little bit when I see other people, even in the ex-Mormon community, saying, if you're not tearing down oppression at everywhere that you see it, then you're not a good person and you can't call yourself a disciple. Okay, I've been in a religious paradigm that told me what I was supposed to do all the time, and I just don't want to be in another religious paradigm like that. I just want to be able to play Yu-Gi-Oh and watch some movies and be good to the people that I interact with. Those are my values, and so it's crazy stuff. So let's see if anyone has the temerity to call and join us. If you would like to call and leave some of your thoughts. Let's see, the phone number is 210-422-2222. We'll see if we can get some calls. I gotta close the door here. Yu-Gi-Oh has joined me, so I have Puppy in my lap, and we'll see some comments in the meantime. What have people been saying while we've been talking? S-Fan says Mormons are totally against moral relativism. That's why they voted for Trump, because he's so much more moral than Biden. /sarcasm. That's a difficult one. Mormon support for Trump may be rooted in their conservatism more than anything else, and the tribe that goes along with that. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. We get a call. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
Jonathan and Samuel.
Hey,
hello.
That sounds like John DeLynn.
This is John DeLynn, enjoying your thoughtful conversation.
How are you?
I don't know if you're able to hear Sam on this.
Oh.
Let me see. Can you hear me at all, John? Let me see. Hold on, microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
I haven't heard Sam yet. Sam, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, I'm not hearing Sam, but I'm
okay.
you, Jonathan.
That's okay. I'll see what I can do to figure that one out.
No problem, but I love the conversation.
So have you been confronted with this issue of, well, if you leave the church, then you're an atheist and you don't have any morals or values, and so why should we even listen to you at all, or anything like that?
Yeah, and I love what you guys said about that. And I was disturbed by, the Kwaku videos. I heard that when I watched a few of them, and I'm really torn about this new approach by FAIRMormon, because on the one hand, it feels like a new low for FAIRMormon, which is saying a lot, but it feels like a new low. But on the other hand, so I want to do my part to show how awful these videos truly are. But at the same time, I know that when I do that, I'm promoting more views and more clicks and more awareness. And I have to ask myself, are we playing into their hand by even giving visibility to their stuff? But I still hold to my prediction that these videos will ultimately be taken down, and that it's going to further tarnish FAIR's reputation for partnering with Kwaku. And I see Kwaku as a symptom, not as the source of the problem. This is what high demand religions like Scientology, like Jehovah's Witnesses, they create these sort of shameless rabid apologists. So Kwaku's just a victim in that sense, but it really is disturbing. What do you guys think? Do you think we're just playing into their hands by talking about them, or do you think ultimately they'll be shown for kind of what they're doing?
What's your take on that, Sam?
Oh, I think the truth can withstand scrutiny and debate. I'm all for everybody in the world watching these videos. I think the comments were disabled on the YouTube channel for a time last night. As of 9 a.m., they were re-enabled. That would be the frustrating part for me, is for there not to be a rebuttal or a response, for them to allow this deceptive, misrepresentative, dishonest analysis to go out into the ether without there being the opportunity for criticism and analysis and rebuttal. I don't know if long-term the comments are going to remain. That would be my problem. But I'm all for, like, this is going to shoot the church in the foot. This is not going to help them long-term.
Yeah,
go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I totally agree. And I think the big point about the tone, when you choose somebody to represent your organization, you are making an investment in a personality. This is why people get Wheaties boxes withdrawn. If that Michael Phelps or whoever it was that was the front place of Wheaties, then it discovered he was doing drugs, and then they took it off. FAIRMormon is stepping out on a limb by allowing Kwaku and this other individual to be their face to the new generation, particularly in light of how risky some of his non-FAIRMormon activities have become. And so that is going to be a problem, I think, for them. It may be the thing that leads them to do that ultimate takedown. But, even going along with that, the way that he treats the audience that FAIRMormon is trying to reach to is so callous and demeaning. I absolutely think it's going to do more harm than good. Did I lose you by any chance?
No, I'm here.
Okay. All right.
And that was my reaction as well, guys. Which is that I made in a comment that Christians are never going to win by being unchristlike. They'll never win. They'll never improve their position. And I think that's what's most sad or disturbing to me about these videos. There's a mocking tone. There's sarcasm. There's even sometimes a little bit of like hip kind of semi-profanity or crudeness. It's just a bad look. And I also agree. I actually wrote on this post I made about it that I wanted every progressive and post-Mormon I know to share these videos with every member of the church, every leader of the church, every bishop, every stake president, every family member and friend, because there's no way that these videos are going to help anybody in the long run. And I can't tell you, for years and years and years now, people say they lost their faith because of Rough Stone Rolling. They say they lost their faith because of CES Letter, Mormon Stories, or Thoughts on Things and stuff, or Year of Polygamy. But I've had many, many people tell me that FAIRMormon caused them to lose their faith. And I can tell you I relate to that, because when I read No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody, the first thing I did was seek out Hugh Nibley's response. And it was called No Man, That's Not History.
Yeah.
When I read I was an earnest, faithful, member seeking for reasonable help. And when I read a ghastly, disingenuous, insulting, unchristlike response to a book that I believed was written in good faith, it damaged my ongoing confidence in the church. And so bad apologetic answers are worse, in my opinion, than no answers. And so, but given the way things have gotten so polarized in America more broadly, that's the only pause I have to feeling like this is going to be an unmitigated disaster. Is just this idea that we're so polarized now that people will just hold on to anything that confirms their position, and they really don't care about evidence or truth or kindness or anything. But in the end, Sam, I and Jonathan, I agree with you both. I do think they're going to do way more harm than good in the end.
If you were a donor to FAIRMormon, how would you feel right now?
The mocking tone.
Yeah, if you're somebody who's just a normal, conventional member of the church, you've amassed a certain amount of wealth for yourself, you really believe in the church, and you want to support an institution that is going to put the best face forward for the church in defending it. So you give, you gift a part of your hard-earned cash to FAIRMormon so they can do the good work that they do, and this is what they show you. I gotta say, if there are any people who are really massively funding the church, FAIRMormon, that aren't the church, they're going to be disappointed. They're going to want to talk to the board of FAIRMormon and say who went into who decided to do this.
Yeah, I was really surprised by the mocking tone, and I didn't think that the material, the humorous, or I felt like it fell flat. The jokes fell flat, and so Mormonism is so inconsistent. Part of the message, of course, Christ, turn the other cheek, pray for them who would use you and persecute you and despitefully use you, love your enemies. And Joseph Smith, in his history, said that the religionists who should have been his friend and who should have, if they thought him deluded, they should have tried to reclaim him with love and kindness. We get that message on the one hand, and then we have Kwaku mocking people who have come to question and leave the faith. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look good.
Oh, come on. You just don't want them to have the same tools you have.
Well,
I do them all the time.
No, I actually have thought of that. So religious trauma is a real thing. Finding out that your entire life has been based on a lie is extremely traumatizing, and people cope with that in all kinds of different ways, including by raging out and fighting back against their abuser. What exactly is the abuse and trauma that Kwaku has experienced, but from the CES letter? I don't feel like he has the same justification even to come out and rage. But in any event, even if he does, we apostates are controlled by Satan, so it makes sense that we would be filled with anger and mock, but he's supposed to be guided by the spirit of love.
Well, yeah, I think the big problem here is that Kwaku doesn't understand Mormon humor. Mormon humor is supposed to be inherently self-deprecating, based on shallow imitations of real pop, and not in a vague attempt to achieve those things in real life. I mean, it's like, I don't know. It's not the type of humor that I think is going to resonate with real Mormon audiences. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
and the younger generation.
Yeah. I mean, because it's either that, or have you seen the video of the Mormon missionaries doing their TikTok holding the Book of Mormon to the Fleetwood Mac song?
I haven't seen that, but I can imagine.
You should check it out. It's good. But I mean, that's more in line with the type of Mormon humor that we should be getting with this.
Right. That actually sounds funny.
Yeah. I don't know.
I'll tell you guys a little bit of a interesting kind of wrinkle in this. My sister is on the board of FAIRMormon.
Oh wow!
Oh really?
And so I'm really curious. I haven't, she always reaches out to me. You know, we have a very good relationship, and she's actually been very, very loving and supportive to me through everything. And, you know, we don't talk about anything that would cause tension between us, and that's kind of how we deal with it. But she'll reach out to me when, you know, when something happens in our world. She'll ask me about it, and I'm going to reach out to her and ask her what Fair's thinking. Not in an accusatory way. I'm sure she has nothing to do with these videos, but yeah, my sister's on the board.
Wow, small world.
Yeah, and it was interesting. Kwaku was dropping hints that there was some new media project that he was involved in. And it was going to totally change the landscape of Mormon apologetics. And I think he's right. He's totally right that the old FAIRMormon style of boring talks that are oblivious to the realities of social media are not reaching younger generation. And so they do have to have someone like Kwaku who's telling them, you've got to really put your neck out there and try to push back. You know, when you think of Elder Holland's talk to the Maxwell Institute, and he said we need to keep our hands firmly in the face of the opposition. This is more firm in the face of the opposition than anything that FAIRMormon has really done. And part of that is because he doesn't have to tie himself to academic standards. I mean, he can be totally ridiculous, and he can play a little bit with some of the flexibility I think that Mormon youth have, you know, making jokes about taking out an Airbnb in Seattle so that you can have sex.
Yeah,
like,
that was
some BYU people were like, I didn't think about that.
Yeah, that was a real surprise. It's so funny that in his discussion of the atheistic narrative of the CES letter, and therefore morals are subjective, therefore why do we care about what Jeremy Reynolds says? It's so ironic that Kwaku brings that up in a church supposedly led by God. Why do we care what Kwaku says? He didn't, that irony I think was lost on him. He has no authority to speak for the church, right?
But that's also true about the entire FAIRMormon enterprise in and of itself. You know,
absolutely.
Oracles of God whose responsibility and duty it is to preach repentance and proclaim the gospel, which should mean answering these pressing questions, and yet they do nothing. They sit back in the comfort of you know, silence, and they can the whole time say, well, we don't get involved in the affairs, and we only come out when it's really important. But then they come out and they do stuff like the B1 celebration and completely drop the ball on their opportunities. Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much for stopping in, John. Did you have something else on your mind?
You guys are great. Oh, I was just going to say, I don't want to hog the line, but I will end by just saying this. When these videos came out, I texted Jeremy Reynolds, and I said to him, there's only really one way to interpret this, which is that Jeremy has been super successful with the CES letter.
Right. Right.
You know, because the church isn't, I mean, number one, they're not going to be talking about this if CES letter weren't highly, highly effective. And the fact that they're getting more shrill in their apologetics means that whatever apologetics they've been doing have been failing miserably. And I think we all know that's true. And so I don't think any of us, our goal is to destroy people's belief or to even harm the church per se. But clearly we want the church to be more open and honest, transparent, compassionate. And in some sense, these videos represent a real victory that, you know, that what we're doing collectively, what Jeremy's done, what we're doing collectively, what your show, Jonathan, is doing, what your family's interview, Sam Pinson, did, and what I'm trying to do is really working, is being effective. And the fact that they have to get more shrill just means they're getting more and more desperate. And at some point, it's going to have to mean the dissolution of that a Christian group can get more and more shrill and survive, because at some point they really do make a mockery of the Christ figure that they claim to represent, and and that's not sustainable in my opinion. So I love you guys. Keep up the great work. Sorry for hogging your line.
Oh, no, no problem at all. It's always great to hear from you, John. All right.
Keep it up.
All right, take care.
See you guys.
Okay, so I just got a message from Sam that I believe his microphone just cut out. And so try to say something, Sam. Can I hear you? Yeah, his microphone's gone. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and cut it short because I got some stuff to take care of as well. And we'll probably come back on again later this week to see what other stuff that we can discuss. And in the meantime, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. See you soon.